Welcome to Module 6 of Cells, Tissues and Regulation. In Topic 6.1 we will learn about homeostasis and thermoregulation. During the course of this video you can open your workbooks to Module 6 and try and answer as many questions as you can from Topic 6.1. Due to the large number of learning objectives for this particular topic, I recommend you pause the video here and have a read of them before continuing. When you think about the fact that your body contains trillions of cells that are constantly working, with relatively small levels of dysfunction, how do you think the body can achieve it all? The answer is through homeostasis. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain a relatively stable internal condition, even though the outside world changes continuously. It indicates a dynamic state of equilibrium or balance, in which the internal conditions vary, but always within a narrow range of limits. Virtually every organ plays a role in maintaining homeostasis. A wide variety of chemical, thermal, and neural factors all act together and interact in complex ways to maintain homeostasis, as maintaining the constancy of the internal environment of homeostasis is essential for the functioning of our body. Now let's learn about how the system operates. Regardless of the factor or event being regulated, the variable of all homeostatic control mechanisms needs to be kept relatively constant. This is achieved by involving at least three factors that work together. A change in the variable is often termed as stimulus. The receptor is a sensor that monitors the environment in response to changes, called stimuli, by sending the information to the control center. The control center analyzes this information from the sensors and determines an appropriate response. The information then flows from the control center to the effector organs, such as the muscles and glands, to correct the deviations in the variable. In this particular example of human body temperature, the variable is the ambient body temperature of approximately 37 degrees centigrade. Whenever there is a rise in the body temperature, the sensitive receptors in the skin and the brain send this information to the control center, which in this case is a thermoregulatory center in the brain, via afferent pathways. The control center then determines an appropriate response and transmits that information via efferent pathways to one of the effector organs, the sweat glands for example, to initiate a response. In this case, it would be to activate the sweat glands. As the sweat evaporates, the body temperature cools, thereby bringing the body temperature back to normal and ending the stimulus. The feedback mechanisms influence the response that is produced in relation to the stimulus. Most of the homeostatic control mechanisms in our body are negative feedback mechanisms. We will learn more about the thermoregulatory process of the body in detail later in this video. The negative feedback controls regulate homeostasis by regulating the response to the stimulus. It can either completely shut off the original effect of the stimulus or reduce its intensity. Let's start with an example of a non-biological negative feedback control. An aquarium heating system connected to a temperature sensing control box, which is programmed to respond if the temperature of the water inside the aquarium falls below 29 degrees centigrade. The control box houses a receptor. In this case, it's a thermometer. If the temperature drops to 25 degrees, the thermometer detects this change and sends the information to the control box via an afferent pathway. The control box responds by turning the heater on through the efferent pathway. When the water temperature reaches 29 degrees again, the control box turns off the heater by the negative feedback control. Without that negative feedback control, the water in the aquarium would continue to heat, eventually killing the fish inside. In all homeostatic systems that are controlled by negative feedback, the variable is never maintained perfectly. but constantly oscillates within the relatively narrow limits of the set point. The set point of a system is the value towards which the system is returned if a disturbance is detected. A set point is usually the midpoint of a narrow range of values within which the body can operate efficiently. Due to factors such as time lag between the receptor and the response, and also due to slight overcorrections, the variable drifts slightly above or below the set point. An efficient homeostatic system minimizes the size or the amplitude of these oscillations. In biology, oscillations occur naturally. Here is an example of oscillations in blood glucose. Maintaining blood glucose levels is one of the most crucial functions of the body, as hypoglycemia, or low blood glucose concentration, can have serious complications, such as a loss of consciousness. The blood glucose levels in the body are tightly controlled by the pancreas, which secretes two hormones that have the opposite effect on glucose levels. As you can see from the graph, the concentration of blood glucose increases after each meal, which stimulates the release of insulin from the pancreas. Insulin causes the uptake of glucose into the cells. In the liver, insulin also stimulates the conversion of glucose to glycogen through glycogenesis. As a result, the blood glucose levels reach the desired set point, and eventually it falls below the set point due to continued insulin activity. When the blood glucose levels are low, the pancreas responds by secreting the hormone glucagon, which stimulates the liver to convert glycogen back to glucose. This brings blood glucose levels back within normal range. The most important points include the fact that the oscillations continue even though no further food has been ingested. This is due to the body needing to increase glucose levels to replace the glucose that is converted to energy within the cells. The example just mentioned contains all the elements of a homeostatic system, namely a set point which can be reset, and a system that monitors the variation from the set point. These systems can have high or low tolerances depending on how crucial the variable is, and how much we wish to spend energy-wise. The more sophisticated the system is, the quicker the response, and smaller the variation. In all cases, the variable oscillates within acceptable ranges, controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. So why is homeostasis so important to biology? Well, the biochemical processes in cells are very sensitive to changes in temperature, pH, and the concentration of nutrient molecules. The external environment of the cells is the extracellular fluid. This fluid is often referred to as the internal milieu of the body. The conditions within the ECF must be kept stable and within a range of tolerable values, or the biochemical operations inside and outside the cells cannot be sustained. The nervous and endocrine systems are involved in directing homeostatic responses, and these feedback systems are constantly operating to maintain the ideal physiological conditions for our body to function. Disease can often be best described as a disruption of homeostasis. Walter Cannon, an American physiologist of the early 20th century, was the first to define the principles of homeostatic control mechanisms. He determined that numerous agents act together to control particular variables, such as blood glucose, blood pressure, and body temperature. Take thermoregulation, for example. To maintain a constant body temperature, the skin, nerves, muscles, blood flow, water balance, renal function, and many of the conscious and unconscious decisions by the central nervous system are all involved, acting in an integrated fashion to help control body temperature. As we discussed earlier, a set point is a value towards which the system is returned if a disturbance is detected, and it is usually the midpoint of a narrow range of values within which the cells can operate efficiently. However, set points for some controlled variables are not constantly fixed over time, and can often vary with the diurnal rhythm, or the circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythms are physical, mental, and behavioural changes that occur in a 24-hour cycle, responding primarily to light in an organism's environment. The core body temperature and cortisol secretion are two such examples where the set points are not constantly fixed. The set points may also change because of the changing physiological conditions or demands, such as a fever, where the core body temperature is increased temporarily, or because of chronic or prolonged insult, as seen in prolonged hypertension. The two graphs on the right-hand side show how the core body temperature and the plasma cortisol levels change during different times of day. A healthy human body fluctuates approximately 1 degree centigrade in 24 hours, lowest in the early morning and highest in the late afternoon. Cortisol is an anti-inflammatory hormone that is released in response to stress. It increases blood sugar and fat levels in the blood and helps the body to resist stresses and dampens the immune system. The plasma levels of cortisol are highest in the mornings, as it helps us prepare for the day ahead. Maintaining homeostasis is all about detection of any changes in the system through receptors, and the use of physiological feedback systems to correct these changes. The central nervous system compares signals from many parts of the body. However, even though the central nervous system is the integrating center, it is not always involved. A signal or a stimulus is only generated when the measured values exceed or fall below the natural set point range. These signals are then sent to affect organs to bring the variable or the value back to the correct levels. The outgoing signals are endocrine or neural signals, and the effector organs are usually the muscles and glands. As you may remember, most of the enzymatic reactions within our cells are temperature dependent. Life itself is entirely reliant on these enzymes operating efficiently. The efficiency of these enzymes can be slowed down with cold temperatures or disrupted by excess heat. When the temperature spikes above the normal range, it can denature proteins and depress neuronal activity. This change in the body temperature can have serious effects. Body temperature averages 37 degrees centigrade, plus or minus half a degree, and is usually maintained within the range of around 35 to 38 degrees centigrade, despite a considerable change in external temperature. Children below the age of 5 may go into convulsions if the body temperature reaches 41 degrees centigrade. In adults, when the core temperature reaches 42 degrees, it can lead to the breakdown of cellular proteins, depression of neuronal function, and eventually death. However, cooling below normal temperature is less immediately damaging, as the reactions in the body are slowed down. Whenever the core body temperature rate is above normal, it activates the heat loss center and triggers the following. When the core body temperature is increased and the blood is warmer than the hypothalamic set point, a stimulus is generated. This stimulus activates the heat loss center in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then triggers dilation of the blood vessels in the skin. This allows the capillaries to become filled with warm blood and allow heat to radiate from the skin. Secondly, if the body is overheated, or if the environment around the body is so hot that heat cannot be lost by any other means, evaporation then becomes necessary. As a result, the sweat glands are activated to spew out large amounts of perspiration. Evaporation of sweat is an efficient means of reducing body temperature. Once the body temperature declines, the hypothalamic heat loss center is then turned off by negative feedback control. A similar mechanism is also seen when the external temperature, or the blood temperature, is low. Decreased body temperatures activate the heat promoting center in the hypothalamus, which triggers the constriction of the skin blood vessels. As a result, the blood is diverted from the skin capillaries and is withdrawn to deeper tissues to minimize heat loss from the skin surface. Furthermore, skeletal muscles are activated, when there is a need for more heat to be generated. As a result, shivering occurs. And again, once the blood temperature rises to the hypothalamic set point, the heat promoting centre is shut off by negative feedback mechanisms. The hypothalamus receives input regarding changes in the body temperature from two kinds of receptors. The peripheral receptors are located on the skin, with numerous epidermal receptors. Peripheral receptors are usually nerve endings that send signals to the central nervous system. These may also be referred to as shell receptors. The deep body receptors are sensitive to blood temperature and are located in the body core, including the hypothalamus. These deep body receptors respond to changes in core body temperature by stimulating the hypothalamus to instigate an appropriate and widespread response. These deep body receptors have more influence than the shell receptors in preventing temperature changes in the core. In the next two slides, we will review thermoregulation. When the peripheral and the core body receptors sense an increase in the temperature, it stimulates the hypothalamus, which, with the help of the cerebral cortex, peripheral nervous system, and the endocrine system, leads to conscious decisions such as seeking water and shade, and it also stimulates immediate unconscious decisions such as increasing the rate of sweat and increasing peripheral vasodilation to lose body heat through evaporation. Furthermore, long-term changes such as reducing muscle tone and perhaps reducing the metabolic rate in general by inhibiting secretions of thyroxine can also arise. Similarly, when the peripheral and the core body receptors detect a decrease in the temperature, it stimulates the hypothalamus, which leads us to make conscious decisions, such as to seek the sun, wear warm clothes, and start shivering. It also triggers immediate unconscious decisions, including decreasing the sweat rate and increasing peripheral vasoconstriction, together with long-term changes in cold climates, such as increasing muscle tone and increasing metabolic activity by secreting more thyroxine. Different body regions have different resting temperatures. The body temperature is a balance between heat production and heat loss. At rest, organs such as the liver, heart, brain, and endocrine systems account for most of the heat production in the body. However, during rigorous exercise, heat production from skeletal muscles can increase 30 to 40 times normal. The skin has the lowest temperature in most circumstances, and blood serves as a major agent of heat exchange between the core, or the inside of the body, and the surface. The organs in the body core that are held within the skull, thoracic, and abdominal cavities have the highest temperature. Of the two body sites that are routinely used in measuring body temperature, the rectum typically has a temperature of about 0.4 degrees higher than the mouth, and is a better indicator of core body temperature. Measuring the core body temperature is of particular significance in diagnosing heat stress and heat stroke, because the surface temperatures often fluctuate and don't tell the true story about what the core temperature is. The core temperature always remains relatively constant, while the shell temperature fluctuates substantially, anywhere from 20 to 40 degrees centigrade, according to the environmental conditions. The normal core temperature during the day is between 36 to 37.8 degrees. As mentioned previously, the core body temperature also fluctuates with the 24-hour cycle, or the circadian rhythm, in which the temperatures usually reach their lowest point at around 6 am and their highest at around 6 pm. Individuals with a high metabolic rate, or those who are very active, maintain temperatures in the upper range of normal. Fever is controlled hypothermia and occurs when the hypothalamic set point is shifted higher by the action of circulating inflammatory cytokines. This can be due to various reasons, such as infections, allergic reactions, and central nervous system injuries. Fever is considered as an adaptive response that seems to benefit the body, because the chemical reactions can occur more quickly, and it also tends to inhibit the infectiousness or the spread of many microbes. The feverish response simply means resetting the hypothalamic thermostat to a higher than normal temperature, so that the heat-promoting mechanisms can kick in. As a result, the body reacts as if it is too cold. Hence, shivering begins to promote heat production. Peripheral mechanisms to conserve and generate heat, such as shivering and vasoconstriction, also occur until the body temperature meets the elevated set point. The higher set point is maintained until the natural body defences or medications reverse the disease process. As a result, the immune response ends and the normal temperature set point is re-established. Vasodilation and sweating now occur to lower the temperature, and the fever is considered to be broken. Heat stress or heat exhaustion can be described as heat-associated extreme sweating and the collapse of an individual during or following vigorous physical activity or exposure to high environmental temperatures. Symptoms include an elevated core body temperature, mental confusion, and fainting due to dehydration and consequent low blood pressure. During heat stress, the heat loss mechanisms are still functional, and the responses can be corrective, meaning the body is trying very hard to bring the temperature down to the normal range, by instigating conscious and unconscious responses, such as seeking exercise, drinking water, sweating profusely, and looking for shade. Exposure to hot and humid environments makes normal heat loss processes ineffective, resulting in hyperthermia. When the core body temperature exceeds 40 degrees centigrade, the hypothalamic activity is depressed and the thermoregulatory control mechanisms work less efficiently. As control is being lost, sweating and blood flow to the periphery is reduced, which leads to a further increase in temperature, and the responses are no longer considered corrective. The heat control mechanisms are suspended, creating a vicious positive feedback loop, which, unless promptly dealt with, can easily lead to death from multiple organ failure, or at the very least there is a distinct possibility of brain damage. Sufferers of heat stroke are likely to behave or speak inappropriately. They may look confused, disoriented, and they may also have dry skin. They often do not request shade or fluids. Heat stroke can be fatal unless corrective measures, such as immersing the body in cool water and administering fluids, are taken. The negative feedback control reduces or corrects the deviation from the set point. On the other hand, a positive feedback control increases the deviation from the set point, pushing it further away from the original value by creating a vicious cycle. Establishment of positive feedback loops usually leads to acceleration into catastrophe. There are very few examples of positive feedback loops in normal physiology, and they are usually of limited duration. This feedback system stops once the process has been driven to completion. The two familiar examples of a positive feedback loop are blood clotting and the enhancement of labour contractions during childbirth. Blood clotting is a typical response that is generated whenever there is a cut or an injury to the vessel wall. Clotting under normal circumstances is a life-saving response. Once a vessel has been damaged, blood elements called platelets immediately start to cling to the injured site and release chemicals that attract more platelets. This rapidly growing pile of platelets forms a blood clot at the site of the injury and prevents blood loss. Under abnormal conditions, uncontrolled, disseminated intravascular clotting is very dangerous, and the positive feedback loop soon becomes established and may become life-threatening by blocking some of the major blood vessels in the heart, leading to a heart attack. The other example of a positive feedback loop is the mechanism in which oxytocin, or hormone released from the hypothalamus, intensifies labour contractions during childbirth. Oxytocin causes the contractions to become more frequent and powerful. These increased contractions cause more oxytocin to be released, which causes more contractions, and so on until the baby is born. The birth of the child ends the stimulus for oxytocin release, and therefore shuts off the positive feedback mechanism. From this video, we've learnt about the principles of homeostasis, negative feedback control, oscillation and the set point, regulation of body temperature, mechanisms of regulating body temperature, thermoreceptors and the role of the hypothalamus, core and shell temperatures, the feverish response, heat stroke, and positive feedback loops.